Good morning and welcome to New America. Thank you all for coming to our session, How We Win. How cutting-edge entrepreneurs, political visionaries, enlightened business leaders, and social media mavens can defeat the extremist threat. My name is Melissa Salick-Verk, and I am a policy analyst with New America's International Security Program. For those of you new to New America, we are a think and action tank, a civic platform that connects a research institute, technology lab, solutions network, media hub, and public forum. The International Security Program aims to provide evidence-based analysis of some of the toughest security challenges facing American policymakers and the public, from homegrown American terrorism to the United States drone wars abroad and the proliferation of drones around the world, to the profound changes in warfare wrought by new technology and societal changes. I'd like to introduce you to our two panelists this morning, Farah Pandith and Peter W. Singer. Farah Pandith is an author, foreign policy strategist, and former diplomat. A world-leading expert and pioneer in countering violent extremism, she is a frequent media commentator and public speaker. She served as a political appointee under Presidents George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, and most recently, she was the first ever special representative to Muslim communities, serving both Secretaries Hillary Clinton and John Kerry. She has served on the National Security Council, at the U.S. Department of State, and the U.S. Agency for International Development in various senior roles. She has also served on the Department of Homeland Security's Advisory Council, chairing its task force on countering violent extremism. She is a senior fellow with the Future of Diplomacy Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School, as well as an adjunct senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Pandith divides her time between Washington, D.C., London, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. We'll be discussing her new book today, How We Win, how cutting-edge entrepreneurs, political visionaries, enlightened business leaders, and social media mavens can defeat the extremist threat. Peter Warren Singer is a strategist and senior fellow at New America. He has been named by the Smithsonian as one of the nation's 100 leading innovators, by Defense News as one of the 100 most influential people in defense news, by Foreign Policy to their top 100 global thinkers list, and as an official mad scientist for the U.S. Army's Training and Doctrine Command. His latest book is Like War, which explores how social media has changed war and politics, and war and politics has changed social media. His past work includes serving at the Office of the Secretary of Defense, Harvard University, and as the founding director of the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence at Brookings, and he has written a number of award-winning books. This morning, we'll get a comprehensive overview of how we can win against international terrorist organizations by going all in order to extinguish this threat. Farah and Peter will touch upon the book's call to action for policymakers, tech entrepreneurs, the media, business professionals, and anyone interested in fighting hate. We'll save the last 20 to 30 minutes or so for audience questions. Please engage with us on Twitter using hashtag HowWeWin and following @NewAmericaISP. Farah's book will be available for sale at the close of today's session. Thank you.
So I want to begin first by thanking you for the very kind introduction and for putting together this event, and all of you for turning out. And I don't want to thank, I want to congratulate you by hitting the trifecta of nonfiction. How We Win is a book that is interesting, important, and timely.
Thank you.
And I think there's also an incredible parallel within it in terms of capturing the personal journey that you went on with the larger journey that the government, but more broadly, American and global society really need to go on and wrestle with when we're talking about the issues within the book. Congratulations, but then again, thank you for joining us. So let's jump right into it. Government style, bottom line, up front. What's the primary goal of the book? What are the key lessons of it?
Thank you, Pete, and I want to thank New America. It's a pleasure to begin my Washington journey here with a friend at my side and somebody who has been a supporter of my work from the very beginning. So it's an honor to be sitting on the stage with you. I mean that sincerely. Let's do Washington style indeed. Why would I even take it upon myself to go through all of this? Because as you will understand after you read the book, for those of you who have not yet, I wrote this book because I know that there are solutions that are available and affordable for all of us. And we are seeing in real time the rise of hate, the rise of us versus them. The manifestations of this are triggering all kinds of things around the globe. As I was taking my Uber over to New America today, I was reading about the attacks in the Netherlands. This isn't something that we have solved. So I've written this book because I want people to understand that they have an option here to be able to vastly change the landscape of us versus them globally. And it isn't about one kind of extremist, it's about the hate that we're seeing around the world.
So let's pull back on this, and I mentioned that idea of journey, both personal, professional, but also kind of political and societal. I actually interviewed you many years back during research for the Like War project, and the stories that you told, not just merely from your role in government, but really how you personally started on this journey. I think they were compelling, but they also kind of captured some of the underlying things going on in that. So talk about what took you from there to here.
You know, when I look back on the work that I've been lucky to do in both Bush and Obama administrations, I have to go back and think about what happened to my family in the mid-90s when I wasn't really paying attention to the issue of extremism. I had not yet gone to graduate school. I was born in northern India in a region that is in the news today. So I was born in Srinagar. And even though I grew up knowing that there was this tension, obviously, between India and Pakistan, I didn't really understand the issues. In the spring of 1993, almost around where we are today, 2 of my family members were killed. And it was the first time that I actually, because our family was affected, and let me be clear that almost every family in Kashmir has lost life over the insurgencies that have taken place over the last many decades. But I came to the table in graduate school with this very fresh family tragedy on my back, and really thinking about what had happened and why it had happened, who these extremists were, and where this ideology was coming from. But I went to the graduate school thinking that I was going to study development work. Because I had worked at the US Agency for International Development, because I was really interested in giving back in a different kind of way. But when this thing happened to our family, I remember talking to professors at the Fletcher School who said to me, why wouldn't you be looking even more into this issue? And in the summer of '94, I went to Kashmir as a graduate student and began to interview militants. And that was my James Bond summer. That's a whole different story, but it began for me this idea of understanding what can happen emotionally to people and how they can be moved to violence. Fast forward to 9/11. And when 9/11 happened, I was in the private sector in Boston, and I remember our building was on the 41st floor overlooking Logan Airport. And I grew up outside of Boston. That's where my family is. And I loved it. I loved my job. Everything was great. But I remember looking out at the airport on this perfect morning, knowing what we were getting the news feeds in, that these people had left from Logan to go do this horrible thing. And I remember just the sense of doom, you know. Could this be somebody who is claiming Islam as their ideology to move forward? What was this all about? I didn't know much about Al-Qaeda, but in the days afterwards, I walked into my boss's office and I said, this terrorist organization is claiming to define my country, America. It is claiming to define my religion, Islam. And I don't care what I do, I don't care which way I serve, but I need to go back and serve in government. And that brought me back to DC in 2003 is when I came back. It took a couple of years to sort of get the clearances on board again. But I came back in thinking, I'm just going to serve, we're going to try to do this. I had no idea I was going to stay as long as I did stay. And it was a privilege to be able to do that. But what it did for me was it gave me not only an insight as to how our country was actually dealing with all of these weird questions that I know we'll get into about what was the ideology that was sparking all of this, but it made me as an American feel extremely strong-willed in this sense of we cannot let this terrorist organization define who we are as Americans and what we stand for. And that
what do you
was
mean
really,
by that?
For me, as somebody who grew up outside of Boston as a Muslim, I never, ever grew up with anyone asking me anything about my identity in this sort of weird way. I never was looked at as sort of an outsider. I was never asked to explain my religion. The most I would get would be when I wouldn't eat bacon or something from a pig, and I would say it's religious, and I don't do that. And then that was fine. But there was never this all day, every day attention on me, this fierce focus on what it could possibly mean for me to be Muslim. Interestingly, Peter, today, in my 50s, I have people asking me why I speak English so well. And it's bizarre. Something has changed in our country. I have people asking me questions about the way I dress and the way I practice my faith that never, ever, growing up outside of Boston, did I ever get questions about. The change that's happened here in America, to get to the heart of your question, we are a diverse nation. We're, thankfully, a nation that believes that everybody should be able to practice their faith freely. And for me, when the attack happened on 9/11, and you had this guy named Osama bin Laden who was trying to say we're a country that hates Muslims, it didn't feel real to me because I had never been looked at in that way, because the people that I went to school with were never looked at that way, because my own family came to this country to practice medicine to serve humanity, not to take away from it. So it didn't make sense for a lot of different reasons, and it made me really mad, because it made me feel as though the false narrative that he was selling to the world about an us versus them, about what America stood for, was wrong. It wasn't a correct analysis of why this country was founded, who in fact we are. No country in the world, of course, is perfect, but mosques can be built here. You can practice your faith freely here as a Jew, as a Christian, as a Hindu, as a Muslim, or as no one of any faith. You have the right to be able to be who you are. And here he is, after 9/11, telling the world that America hates the West hates Islam, telling the world that we don't have the right to practice our faith freely, and it really hit home to me personally.
I want to hit this. Here he is,
Yeah.
2001, saying this false narrative. 2019, he's dead. Is he right, or did his narrative win? Those are two different questions, but you know why I'm pulling this thread.
Sure. There's a reason why I talk to you about what it feels like to be in my 50s in America today, with people asking me that question. When we were attacked on 9/11, America came together in a very specific way. We did not want an external force, a terrorist organization or a terrorist of any kind, to tell us who we were as Americans. I think too about the Boston Marathon bombings. Again, we're almost at that anniversary. Boston came together as Boston Strong. We're not going to let this define us. And yet, here we are today in America, where that same landscape has been turned on its head. We are seeing a push and a pull because of political forces. And as you know, I was a political appointee for both a Republican president and a Democratic president. I'm not talking about the politics of it. I'm talking about a very different kind of set of circumstances that we are in that are not just within our country, but are global, with external forces that want to define us in a particular way. And I find that unbelievably scary. We're almost in a more dangerous moment today than we were right at the 9/11 point.
So in the book, and a connection point for this is in the book, you talk about the system of extremism. Unpack that. What do you mean by that, and how does that link back to this notion of external but also internal forces?
Right. When I began to write this book, I really wanted to be able to explain from my perspective, having traveled to nearly 100 countries, what it is I was seeing, because there are lots of dots that often, and we'll get to the point of what
I'm going to interrupt here, because someone in the audience doesn't know specifically your personal history. You just said, oh, I traveled to 100 countries, like as a toss-away line. Why were you in 100 different countries?
So when I was serving in the Bush administration, I right after the Danish cartoon crisis was asked to move from the National Security Council to the State Department to operationalize the idea of how do we begin to build the antibodies in a system to stop the appeal of an us versus them ideology, because we had seen that something that happened in Copenhagen was affecting a life in Kabul. And it was this is called the war of ideas. What's the ideological component that we are actually thinking about? As we began to think about what we ought to do, we knew that government couldn't obviously have credibility with those forces on the ground to be able to tell them, don't find this ideology appealing. We know that peer groups talk to peer groups. We had to do a better job of listening to what was taking place on the ground. And so we began to look at communities within Europe, to talk to them about what it felt like to be a Muslim under the age of 30 as they were growing up. So whether I was in Finland or I was in Sicily, I was having the same kinds of conversations with hundreds and hundreds of community groups all over Europe. And by the end of the Bush administration, had gone to 55 cities and 19 countries talking to young European Muslims. And what I was beginning to see across the board was something, even though each country had a different origin story for the Muslims that were there, some countries had colonized, some people were not some countries were not colonizers. Some populations were on their second generation of Muslims, others were on their fourth. Things were very different, but there was one point that connected every single community that I spoke to, and that was that that young people growing up post 9/11 were having this like fierce crisis of identity. They were asking questions about the difference between culture and religion, what it meant to be Muslim, with the context of 9/11 all around them, and surround sound with the word Islam or Muslim on the front page of their paper, online and offline. They could never get away from it. Now, Peter, I thought by the end of the Bush administration, what I was seeing in Europe was unique because I thought this was something that was happening to Muslims that were living as minorities. And you could almost understand that that would happen. When I briefed Hillary Clinton at the end of the Bush administration, right at the beginning of the Obama administration, I was on my way out. I had, I think, a couple of weeks left at the State Department, and I was sort of winding things down. One of the things I said to her in the briefing was, please don't ignore the importance of Europe. Please understand the work that we've done on the war of ideas, that there are things or systems that we can build, peer-to-peer systems, that will make a difference in terms of building resilience in communities. And when I briefed her, she was asking a lot of amazing questions about, well, what were the European governments doing, and why was the American government in here? And people were listening to what the American government said, even in the context of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so she was asking the right kinds of questions. And by the end of the briefing, she said, you're not leaving. I thought she was kidding, but she wasn't kidding. And she asked me to do what we did in Europe, but to do it around the world. So the reason why I was able to go to nearly 100 countries was because we had taken this approach of listening at the grassroots level, making sure that we basically were talent scouting, finding amazing people who were actually pushing back against the us versus them ideology, manifested in a lot of different ways. It wasn't just sort of one thing that they did, but we were linking them together and building like-minded networks. So when I talk about what I heard and what I saw as special representative, it wasn't as though it was this easy thing for me to say, well, I was working as special representative 2009 to 2014, and this is the one thing you have to take away. There were lots of things that I was seeing that all of a sudden, by the time you get to your 40th country, and then your 50th, and then your 70th, and you're seeing the same thing, whether I'm in Suriname or I'm in Malaysia, you understand there are commonalities that are going across the board. So the system that's underlying extremism is, what are the things that I saw that was the platform that allowed this us versus them to build? And it was important for me in this book to express to the reader, you can't just look at this in the context of this one-off over here. Here are the similarities. I'm connecting the dots for you the way I saw the world and what I saw. So there were several planks to the system, one of which is this identity crisis that I thought was only happening in Europe, but what freaked me out and was really shocking was that even in Muslim majority countries, young Muslims, and this is the key, the demographic where we're looking at are millennials, those that were under the age of 30 as they were growing up post 9/11, were having that same kind of identity crisis. They were asking the same questions as the Muslims that I met in Spain, or I met in the Netherlands, or I met in France. So I could be, for example, in a place like Pakistan, I could be in a place like Morocco, I could be in a place like Indonesia, and the demographic was asking the same thing. So that's a really important part that I thought people should know. So there's an identity crisis. The second plank was, and we can talk more about this, is this idea of the role of Saudi Arabia and what they have done around the world. And while I sort of kind of had heard about things that our government had called Saudi Arabia out on, for example, textbooks or translations of the Quran, or pushing out a idea of the other in terms of how they're treating minorities. What was profound was that no matter where in the world I went, there was a system in place that was decades long that the Saudis had deployed to make sure we were eradicating any kind of evidence of Islam that was not the way in which they interpreted it, and most importantly, pushing forward an idea that Islam was a monolith. And that's what extremists want you to believe, that there's only one way to be a Muslim. So you have the identity crisis, you have the role of Saudi Arabia that was bearing itself out, and then you had, obviously, part of the system is obviously, and you're the expert here, but how the demographic was expressing their identity through technology. And that force multiplier was very significant, not just how the bad guys use technology, but how peers were connecting identity across technology. So these are some of the ways in which I was unpacking what I saw. I coin a phrase in the book that I call Halal Ization to describe this very peculiar thing that was happening to men and women in terms of trying to live their identity out loud, kind of like a lifestyle brand, which one can laugh at. But when you think about the implications culturally, it really surprised me that we were not, as government, picking up on these sort of cultural cues that were going to make a difference. Because at the baseline here, Peter, the thing that I think we have to understand is we're not just talking about a small number of people. 1/4 of the planet is Muslim, and 1 billion people are under the age of 30 who are Muslim. So if you understand these trends and you understand what's taking place, we have to get serious about what we're seeing.
The subtitle of your book, though, is not how to defeat Al-Qaeda, ISIS, or we could have the wonderfully awful debate on the terminology, radical Islam, violent Islamic extremists, violent Islamist extremists. It's actually just extremist. So one, why that choice? And then the next thread to pull on that, can you apply what you've learned from that journey in writing the book to what we saw just play out in New Zealand and some of the lessons of why and in turn, how to respond?
Such an important question. We, as we're sitting here in Washington. The policy establishment has fallen over itself since 9/11 to get the language right on what it is we call the ideological us versus them antibodies that we put in the system. This concept of a ideological war came out of Bush's 2006 national security strategy when he talked about a battle of arms and a battle of ideas. Anybody who knows anything about anything on what we're dealing with now knows that we have, we cannot only measure success for any kind of group in the world if you're only looking at the physical manifestations of a group. You have to understand why they're able to bring recruits in, right? So that ideological war is the thing that I focused on. In the roles that I had, obviously, I was looking at one dimension of the us versus them. I was looking at how terrorist organizations that use the name of Islam use the us versus them, okay? But clearly, there are different types of us versus them around the world. When I was thinking about how to talk about this problem that we're having, what are the solutions? This is a book written out of optimism. This is not a doom and gloom, we'll never win this. There's solutions here based on everything I've seen. You can apply what I know will work from government, from the private sector, for regular citizens to any kind of us versus them. It's how to stop the appeal of this. So I wanted to make sure that I wasn't using language that only said I'm talking about Al-Qaeda, or I'm talking about Shabab, or I'm only talking about the Taliban, or the so-called Islamic State. I wanted to be clear and fair that my experience in the navigation of my work since 9/11 has been around young Muslims, and I can speak to that firsthand. But as I look at the tragic events that have happened in the last couple of days in New Zealand, I know that some of the things that I talk about in this book in terms of solutions for what each of those different sectors have to do are absolutely applicable to the kind of tragic situation we're in today in the world, where there is a rise of hate. I remember, Peter, talking at the State Department in 2007 about the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. And I remember saying that we cannot just put that aside to the democracy, human rights, and labor part of the State Department to be able to say, this is going to be in a human rights report, we're going to talk about anti-Semitism. And as it's growing in Europe, and as people who have survived the Holocaust are dying because they're getting older, and there's an increase of Holocaust denial, all of these things are really important for us to understand. And I remember people, people's eyes glaze over. They think, oh gosh, yes, we're not really talking about a rise of hate, but we are talking about a rise of hate. There is something, and tragically, here we are in 2019, and we're not just seeing groups like the so-called Islamic State and the thing that comes after it. We're not just seeing what is going to happen with Osama bin Laden's son Hamza and how he recalibrates Al-Qaeda, but we're now seeing in our own country a rise of us versus them around white, sort of the white manifesto. And like other groups, you are seeing extremists learn from each other and learn in real time. It is not isolated. We cannot look at something in New Zealand and think, that's way over there. It has no bearing on what's happening here. We know, we have learned things over the last 20 years almost since 9/11 that everything is connected. So I want us to understand the word extremist in a real way.
Can you give examples of that real-time learning? Because it's very top of mind for everything from policymakers to media right now, is the question of, obviously there's many parallels and similarities between the extremist ideologies of far-right extremism, what yields an ISIS, but there's also operational similarities, there's use of technology, and there's this question of how much of this is just the natural, what works now operationally, what works online, and how much of it is them actually learning from each other, mimicking, even though they claim to have diametrically opposed ideologies?
It's a great thing for us academically to understand, but it's a profoundly serious one emotionally for us to understand, because we're not able to disrupt that learning at a fast enough pace. So if people are trying to evoke emotional responses quickly, they're going to look at what's the last tragedy or what's the last thing that they can learn from. So this idea that this guy put the murder on a live stream so that he could not only spread it virally, but he could make sure that he was giving as much grief to the situation as he could, because he knew that those images were going to go over and over. He knows that these technology companies are not taking down the videos fast enough. He knows people will be able to slice pieces of this and use it for their propaganda. How does he know that? Well, let's just go back to ISIS, for example. What happened when we watched that Jordanian pilot burn in the cage? What happened when we saw the beheadings? What happened when we listened to the sermons? I mean, this is over and over. We are learning, it doesn't mean just because people are learning lessons from groups that they don't like, that they can't learn the lessons. Let me take a much softer, this is not I'm not giving a pass to this, but this is just something historic. When you think about when the Bamiyan Buddhas were decimated by the Taliban, and the world, watched as the dynamite, eradicated them from the Earth's surface. Was anybody asking why the Taliban thought it would be a really great idea to eradicate cultural history? We weren't asking that question, but they knew what they were doing. They had learned lessons from, actually from what Saudi Arabia had done, from eradicating any evidence of anything that came before. Saudi Arabia also had learned lessons from what Hitler did. He did the same thing with the cultural pieces. So it isn't just in real time, Peter. It's things that are learned over time. What can you do to make sure that you get to your goal? I think one of the things that we have to do as a community of humans on this planet is to understand that the lessons that have been learned by all of us are lessons we sometimes understand and absorb, but some of those things are in the back of our head. When I think about how the media is responding to the attack in New Zealand, one of the lessons, and this is to give them, they've learned, let's not use his name. Let's not, we took some time to get to that place, didn't we? Remember when 9/11 happened, we were airing Osama bin Laden's sermons in real time for hours on end, 20 years ago. We've learned not to try to give that kind of platform to the bad guys.
So I want to get to the what can we do, but let's take a pause, because we're being obviously super dark, and as you mentioned, this is a book that has an optimistic side of it. So before we get to the what can we do, I want you to do something that writers are like parents. They secretly have their favorite child. So who of all the characters and scenes, who is, and that's for my kids watching online, that is me making a joke. I mean,
His kids are great, though, I have to tell you.
So you've got this packed with characters and scenes. What's the one that is most heartening or brings you the most joy? What's one that stands out in that way?
There are lots of really great anecdotes in the book.
Again, you can't say I love all my children equally.
Well, let me give you two, okay? Let me give you two different types. Can I do that? One is one that just makes me laugh out loud every time I think about it, and the other is somebody who I met early on in my work when I was in the Europe Bureau, who just had a way about him in terms of describing what was possible. So the one that was just really funny, I was in Timbuktu, and I
Not figuratively,
no, I was
literally.
actually in Timbuktu, And we, when you travel with the US government, of course, there are people who are with you, there are note takers and all these kinds of things. Anyway, so we get out of the car, and for those of you who have not been to Timbuktu, it is one of the most incredibly beautiful places I have ever been. It has a spirit about it. It's remarkable. So we're going through the old town. We're going around corners. We're getting lost in this whole thing. There are beautiful doors everywhere. I'm looking around. We finally get to this old building, and we go up the stairs. We're going to meet this sort of the head imam. Okay. And it's an honor to be able to do this. Really excited. All of us are really happy that he's agreed to meet with me. We go into his office space, which is just this very large room, and on the walls are all these pictures of very famous people that he has met. There's one with him and Jimmy Carter. There's one. There are various people. So we all sit, and he's like in sort of in the back, and he's wearing, and forgive me because I don't know the name of it. It's a special kind of robe that they wear in Timbuktu, but it has a lot of material, and it has embroider in it, and he had sort of a turban, and with him, behind him, and around him were also imams. So there were all of these imams looking very regal and in the back, and we were way down over there, and so it was like a very serious meeting, and we're all just getting ready to start, and we're just about to start, and all of a sudden, Jingle Bells starts playing. And I was like, am I hearing this? Am I hearing this? Is anybody else hearing this? But I just tried to stay calm for a moment because I thought, okay, something is up. But it's ringing and it's ringing. It's the phone. It's the phone ringer, on his phone. And so he puts his hand in his big, thing, pulls out the phone, and he's playing Jingle Bells, and he presses it, and he kind of laughs, and then we went on the way, and it was great, and it was great because not just it was Jingle Bells, and we're in Timbuktu, and we're in this very serious, like we're going to talk about Islam, but it was the humanity of it. It was real, and he wasn't all hyped up on, this is a Christmas song that I can't have on my phone. It was really just a normal, wonderful moment. So that makes me laugh every time I think about it. In terms of a character who inspired me, there's a guy in northern England, in Luton, named Luqman Ali. And Luqman is a guy who I met who it just has a way about him. Luton is a very working class town in the United Kingdom. It is not filled with, like many very old towns, some really beautiful architecture in the UK. It's very simple and very basic. And what he wanted to do in 2007 was to say to the young kids who were finding the us versus them ideology appealing and confused about what it meant to be Muslim, what he said was, there are so many characters in Islam. Islam is almost 1,400 years old. I want to pull them out and make them real for people in a way that will give the kids agency, and they can see themselves in these characters from history. And I said, look, Mom, there are so many characters. And he sort of said to me, he's like, I've been working on this for many years. And he had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds he had done all this history, worked through history of women and men of all different kinds from Islamic history that he could point to say, these are your superheroes for today. And he was turning those stories into street art, street theater. And he was getting the kids to work with him. And it was a really powerful example of one person who began to take an interest in how to convey a new kind of identity to these folks based on an ancient stories. The Kayal Theater Company, when you talk about this, people think, oh, give me a break. You're telling me street art is going to stop the kids from joining a bad group? That's not the point. The point is they are interested in learning about their identity, and we have to give them a way that might work for them. For Luqman, that was the way he was doing it. One of the reasons I love his story is because we often don't think about how powerful culture is, and culture is ultimately one of the most powerful forces we can use to be able to manipulate the way people think about their own power.
Mm-hmm. So for the last question that I'm going to ask before we turn it over to the audience, it's the classic Washington, what can we do? I'd like to frame it this way. You break down in the book the role of government, private sector, civil society. Queen for the day, but queen that has to be realistic.
Yeah.
One thing that government can do, one thing that the private sector can do, one thing that civil society can do.
Well, let's start with the easiest one of all. All of us are witnessing us versus them and the rise of hate. And citizens need to understand that they can no longer be lazy on hate. We can no longer say this is somebody else's problem and they're going to deal with it. So I want every person to think in their own lives on a daily basis what they can do to give respect to somebody else. It sounds like Pollyanna, but even the one-to-one interventions can make a difference. So that's one thing. From the perspective of government, there is a very long list of things, but if I'm queen of the day, the thing we don't have, Peter, if you can believe it, all these years since 9/11, is an actual strategy for the ideological war. We have a strategy for what we do to use every lever in the physical force. We do not have a roadmap. We do not even know what our assets are. We have nobody who wakes up every single day looking at everything we can do in the ideological war. And that blows my mind. 20 years after 9/11, how is it possible that we cannot even know what and who we can deploy? There is a chairman of the Joint Chiefs for a reason. Where is that person for the ideological war? So that is ultimately, if you don't have a strategy, we can't get anything done. Then on the private sector, if there's only one thing that I would say to the private sector, it isn't just about the technology companies that we all think just need to take things down and everything will be okay. The private sector, all aspects of the private sector have one thing in common. They understand behavior. They have lots of information about how people behave and what they do. The NGOs that are working on the front lines of this problem, which is ultimately the local solutions are how we build the antibodies in the system. We ask NGOs to do this work because government doesn't have credibility, because we don't know how to build the kinds of things that we need to do. And these NGOs spend their days trying to get this done for us while they're trying to raise money to keep the lights on and pay their staff because they're nonprofit organizations. The private sector should get real and help the NGOs scale up what it is that they are already doing.
Great answers. Okay, let's open it up to all of you. Please raise your hand. I'll call on you. If you can identify yourself. And finally, all questions end with a question mark is the rule. So let's begin right here in the green, day after St. Patrick's Day. Go holding on.
Thank you. I have a question about which...
Actually, can you introduce yourself first?
My name is Mark Nadell. Which pundits or analysts do you look to for insights on developing issues? I mean, I'm thinking of Fareed Zakaria, David Gerken, and in particular with Saudi Arabia, where you looked at the history. Were you fooled by MBS originally, or did you understand this and other people got fooled?
So two different questions there. He sneakily packed two in. One, what are the useful sources that you turn to for insight? And then separate question is you came out swinging on Saudi Arabia. MBS. How were you? What did you see on the narrative early on? Where are you now?
Great. They're two really great questions. Let me start with the first one. I tend to look to my partners on the ground, the NGOs around the world that are doing the work day in and day out, because they're the ones who are seeing things in real time. They're the ones who are working on projects and initiatives and programs and can tell us what's working and what isn't working and what needs to be done. So there are some wonderful, and I'm not going to call out one particular think tank in town because I have colleagues in all of them who are doing great work on this issue. So whether you're looking at folks here at New America, you're looking at people at George Washington's program on extremism, whether you're looking at Brookings or you're looking at the Washington Institute. There are specialists in each of those places that have, in fact, been looking at the ideological war and been looking at how the us versus them is playing out. So I would urge you to take a look at some of the reports. CSIS, and I'll call them out only because I was working on the commission. In 2016, there was a commission report called Turning Point that was a bipartisan commission report that was done on what American government needs to do on the ideological war. I would turn your attention to that because it really lays out what needs to be done. And I would turn your attention to the Department of Homeland Security's 2016 Task Force on Combating Violent Extremism. It is a 50-state plan on how do we stop the us versus them state by state. Again, I worked on that too, so I will tell you those are places where a lot of research, and if you look at the bibliography, you'll see where we got our data. On the issue of Saudi Arabia, I have come out swinging. And I've come out swinging because I feel something very strongly, and that is I had the privilege of serving my nation for 3 presidents. And the American taxpayer paid my salary to travel around the world to see what I saw. And I feel strongly that it is my responsibility to tell the American public what it is I saw. Now, when I'm in government, I can only go so far because you're in government and you kind of have to, there are protocols in place. When I left government in 2014, it was not because I had served a lot, but one of the reasons I wanted to be able to write this book was I wanted to tell you from my own perspective what it is I was seeing. This is before MBS came into power. There's a difference between the system that they have deployed over many decades, and there's not enough time today to go through all of the methods that they have used globally. But the implication that the United States government and the American people are not standing up for what it is we should, which is to make sure that we don't see more of that around the world, is very concerning. MBS's approach on the ideological front was to come out strong and to say, we want to do more than ever before to make sure that we stand against these extremists. They stood up a multi-million-dollar outfit they built it in Saudi Arabia that is a state-of-the-art machine that monitors what's happening in the online space. Presumably because they believe that they can go out in real time and counter what the bad guys are putting out there, which is not enough. But so I visited that organization called Itadel. It's spectacularly impressive. It's where you saw President Trump go to put his hand on the orb during his first trip out of the gate as president. But sir, I will say this. I have not seen any change whatsoever in the efforts of Saudi Arabia to pull back on the things that I know are happening around the world that they are responsible for. One of which, for example, is the way in which they are sending off Qurans around the world that have been translated in a very specific way. And what their response has been to American government when we ask, yes.
Specific way, how? You got to unpack that again.
So one of the things that we have to be careful about as Americans, and as American government, rather, it's more particular, we are not in the business of telling people how to live their religion out loud. We do not take a position on what is real Islam, what is not, who's the better Muslim. That's not what I mean. But what we know is that the translations of the Quran have been done in such a way that they make sure that the us versus them is embedded in things that are not part of the original translations. I would recommend reading Zia Sardar, who is a scholar and an expert on this issue, and he can really unpack this for you. We have called this out in our reporting from the State Department that we see that the translations of the Qurans have gone out in a particular way, and they're free. They're all over the world, and textbooks that have gone out, again, calling out on this sort of monolithic interpretation, a very strident interpretation of how to live as a Muslim. Now, Saudi Arabia has said that they have paid attention to our complaints, that they have, in fact, pulled back. They've changed the textbooks. The Qurans are not going out. That is not what we know to be true. And so that's one way that I think, you can sort of, if you say something, I'd like to see it actually in action. We can monitor and see the changes. They have not happened.
Another question. Right there in the front. Yeah, actually, you.
Pretty quick question. You'd mentioned disrupting the learning process. In your experience, did you find a narrative format or a type of action that can actually effectively disrupt the learning process? And what does that look like?
So for those people who don't know what the Global Engagement Center is, and I appreciate the work that you're doing there, one of the things that I have to be frank with you, that I come out really hard in the book about the GEC. The Global Engagement Center, in my view, is doing, the goal is really great, but the manifestation of how we do it is troubling to me because we don't have enough people, we don't have enough skill sets on the ground, and the legitimacy of the United States government going in and trying to do that counter speech just doesn't make sense to me. So when I talk about disruption and learning, it has to come from credible people within the local communities who can do that, and that happens in a lot of different ways. It's not just a somebody who has a theology that can talk through sort of what Islam is or what it isn't. It isn't just somebody who is working on the learning according to hadiths or learning. It is about listening at the cultural listening at a granular level, and making sure we understand how kids interpret their own identity. So for us to be able to do that well, it means that their own peers can make a difference to how they're learning, and they need to be given, and programs that we have tested need to be scaled so that it's not just happening in schools in terms of how they think about themselves, but it's also how parents understand how the bad guys are manipulating the internet to prey upon their young people. It's also how young people understand the messages that the bad guys give them off and online and why they do it. And it's also to understand, and this is really, really important, the journey that their own peers took towards the dark side and have come back so that they can talk kid to kid about what really happened, or youth to youth what really happened to them. So former extremists are really important. One of the things that we have an opportunity to do as we see all these people coming back from Syria is to take their content, their stories, and use them in ways that can actually make a difference to the young people who might find the next version of this appealing. There's no strategy in place at all, anywhere in the world, to mine that content and do something real with it.
Okay, so we got front right, front left. Let's give back right there in blue.
I'm Bob Berg. I chair the Alliance for Peace Building, which recently hired as its CEO the person who recently ran DRL. The interesting thing going on in town, in a lot of parts of town, is that people aren't just trying to figure out how to do the status quo ante, but trying to think ahead on big issues about new things to happen. And I've only owned your book for a matter of minutes, so forgive me, but you do have a little discussion on public diplomacy, I see. And but is there a center of gravity of really rethinking the CVE approach and really thinking institutionally what ought to happen? For example, a resurrection of real public diplomacy work.
Sir, I can't wait for you to get through the book, and I hope you'll still like me when you get to the end of it on public diplomacy. I think that there is a role for public diplomacy in our government, and it's one in which Congress should be spending more time and energy on soft power, on the people in our embassies that need the resources to do the work that we should be doing in the field of public diplomacy. That's a very long and very important conversation. This book is not about public diplomacy. We made some big mistakes after 9/11, sort of floundering, trying to figure out how we're trying to do things. It isn't about us trying to convince somebody else how to love us. That is not what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do is to take that young person and to tell them in a way that makes sense for them, and most of the time it's not the US government telling them, it's somebody who has agency with them, to say what the bad guys are saying isn't correct and it's not right. That is a different thing. So this quote, winning hearts and minds stuff, belongs in a different, on a different roadmap for a different purpose and a different goal. I'm all in. I think we ought to give a lot of attention to what we can do to do public diplomacy better. But the work that I've been doing on how to stop young kids from finding this ideology appealing, it is not here. It is over here. So you asked the question about countering violent extremism. If, in fact, we went back and looked at what it is we know we have to do, it is not a conversation that has to be recalibrated on the ideological war. I am so tired of 20 years after 9/11, this town talking about what we call it. Call it unicorns and rainbows. I don't care what you call it. But understand that there is a role for soft power. There is a role for our government to play in scaling up how we design a system to make sure that young kids don't find an us versus them ideology appealing. The problem is not countering violent extremism. The problem is we keep talking about what we ought to do in a reconfiguration as opposed to giving the money, the resources, and the skill set to scaling what your taxpayer dollar has already spent money on. If we did one thing, and one thing only, scale all the experiments and all the programs that we've spent 20 years building at the right pace, 24/7, and let's see what happens after a couple of years.
Okay, back left quadrant, all the way there. Yeah.
Hello, Adam Kaplan, USAID's Office of Transition Initiatives. As to roles, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role that you see for social media and that industry. There's trends away from more open conversations towards more private conversations, and there's the embedded profit interest of social media in making sure that we're all outraged, which seems to work against their interest in actually partnering with civil society in ways that might make a difference.
So I'm going to take that question and break it up into two parts.
Okay.
First is, I said queen for the day, so same thing, social media companies, which is actually because they are run like digital kingdoms.
Yes.
Literally, one person can decide to change it one way or another. So key policy shift at social media companies. And then the second is there is a transformation within one of the key, not just kingdoms, but empires, Facebook, of moving from a model of openness to this discussion came out just 2 weeks ago, Facebook becoming more about a space of private conversations. What will be the effect of that on the discussion of extremism?
So queen for a day, there's a lot that can be said, sir, obviously, on how the technology companies have looked at this issue and how long it's taken for them to recognize that they have a bigger role to play. Facebook is one of the largest countries in the world, okay? There are norms of action, of responsibility. These companies are made of humans. The actions that are taking place, I don't have to give the story to you, you know it. So what is it that I would want them to do? While they've been late to the game, they have come to the game, and they are, in fits and starts, helping nonprofit organizations do the thing that they know how to do, okay, which is great. But they're not doing it at the scale that they can, and they're capable of doing it. So you talked about the issue of profit. I am not sure why you wouldn't want to go all in if you're a technology company and show us what you're capable of doing if you scale things. There's a way to do this. They do not, their argument has often been, we are trying, we don't quite know what is good, what's bad, we want freedom to be able to navigate through some of these conversations. We don't have the luxury of time at the moment. I don't believe takedown is the solution here, the only solution, as much as we need to. Some of the stuff they have to do, obviously, but people tend to think if you just take things down, it's fine. It's what goes back how can you bring new content in, and how do you change the algorithms so that kids who are looking for the bad stuff are coming face to face with ways in which they get off of that journey. We have tested ways to be able to do that. And I'd like to see us actually see it deployed in a way that is 24/7, not a little bit here and not a little bit there. So my one thing would be scale at the pace that we know is needed. Okay, there are many other things I would actually say for the technology companies, but if I only had one choice, in terms of how we think about the shift of private conversations, I don't think we're ready yet to understand what's actually coming. Because I think that we've been late to the game to see how the bad guys have manipulated platforms that are just really obvious to all. We all have the same tools in our toolbox. It's not like they have something special that we don't have, but it's how they're using it. We don't yet know, Peter. That's the honest answer. I am frightened by what is to come because we haven't been able to catch up with what we have seen already. We're not actually doing everything that we can do. That is the biggest tragedy of all since 9/11. Rather than keeping up the pace with we're trying everything, we're not trying everything. Just because people say we are doesn't marry with what the reality is. Let us only hope that we can catch up to this new philosophy on what they want to do in a way that's ahead of the bad guys, not catching up with them.
I might push back at you. I think we do know because we've had a couple of national scale tests of it. One example would be the Brazilian election.
Yeah.
Another would be the series of riots in India. So if you move to that model, it doesn't mean that hate and extremism faces more friction. Actually, it just becomes harder to track.
No, but that's fair. That's definitely fair. Do you think, and I'll ask you because you know more about this than I do, as we think about, we talked about this in my book, I talked to Peter for my book, obviously. Can we switch to AI for just a second? When we're looking at some of the ways the bad guys will deploy AI, do you think that our companies in America are ready for that?
No. In both ways. I mean, so let's be clear. First, the shift, what Facebook is announcing is and it's not yet certain whether they will go down that pathway, but that shift is which you bring up, is about a very different set of considerations. It's a vision of Facebook and its future, more looking like a different profit model, like akin to China's WeChat, but it's also about defending the empire because it makes it harder for Facebook to be potentially broken up into parts. So it's kind of a anti-monopoly law play, but back to this space. It has ripple effects into the story of hate and extremism, just like, for example, live streaming did. The companies did not plan for that to be part of the discourse around their product, but it will inherently. So I don't think they're making the decision with anything in mind related to this topic, but they're going to be stuck with it again. So there's this wonderful cycle. But
right.
The AI part of it, yeah, we already know that, like every other technology, it will be used for both good and bad by good and bad people. So if you think of the phenomenon of the pushing out imagery, well, now you have the possibility of pushing out hyper-realistic false imagery. That will be done for entertainment. It will be done for politics, and the people who do it for politics will be people that we agree with and people that we think are anathema.
But this is part, and it's connected to what you're saying. We're always playing catch up, right? I mean, if you know that a new technology or a new dimension of what's happening has the capacity of being used by the bad guys, why are we not thinking about the manifestations of that as we roll it out, as we think about things? It's no surprise to anyone that Twitter can be a platform for good or a platform for bad. And we're now in a place where things have gone so crazy that you can't bring it back. We weren't thinking through some of these things and I'm not talking about not being innovative and stemming creativity. I just think the responsibility of technology companies and others in the world that we're living in today has to be one in which we're real about bad actors that can manipulate things that they're using. I mean, that's the world that we're living in today.
Yeah, I think it's an issue. You pulled a thread on me, so
Yeah, it's good.
It's a problem set of denial.
Yes.
And first is the denial of, oh, my product can be used for both good and bad. No, you know, in essence, you go in with that understanding, and you red team it before you deploy it to figure out how might bad guys use it and how can I limit that.
Exactly.
You should not be surprised that someone is live streaming, whether it's a teenage suicide or an attack. That should not catch you by surprise, which it did back when those products are first deployed. And then the other aspect of denialism goes to the denialism that we have towards all the different forms of extremism.
Right.
So, for example, over the course of your journey, the internet went from being quite hospitable to ISIS, black flags everywhere on Twitter, to now they're mostly to AI,
Yep.
mostly screened out. Interesting that 1488, a white supremacist mantra used by everything from the Pittsburgh synagogue shooter, whatnot, not screened out. Why? Because that's a harder conversation
Right.
for us to have.
Right.
All right, I've talked too much. Let's
No, but
jump
this is why it's so great.
right there. Yep.
I'm Mike Nelson. I've been teaching internet studies at Georgetown, and I've been in a communications culture and technology program. This has been an incredibly rich conversation, particularly about communication and culture. You just started talking about technology. You've been asked to be queen for a day. You've been asked to be CEO for a day. I want to ask you to be Chief Technology Officer for a day. And in particular, how could technology help the truth spread as fast as falsehoods? And how could truth help citizens do what you said, not be lazy about hate? How could we mobilize 100% of our community to deal with this issue? Today, 99% of us think, you 1%, you security people, you CEOs, you take care of this problem. Is there some technology that we're lacking? Is there something that could really help us move beyond where we are today?
The technology is a human heart. And, you know, we are watching our world do this. It's not robots that are doing this. These are humans that are doing this. Technology companies are made by people who live lives outside of their role in the technology companies. I looked when I was writing this book because I believe that there is a very strong role for the private sector to play here. One that for the longest time we're like, you know, it's something for government. Terrorism is too scary. If I had $1 for every private sector, you know, CEO I talked to who said our shareholders will never touch this issue. It has something to do with terrorism. They don't want us, our brand, you know, on and on and on and on. And I've said, we're fighting hate. We're protecting youth. That's what this is. This is what this is. It's protecting youth. Sorry, can't do it, can't do it. I come back to leaders in the business space who have pushed the system to say, even though our brands, our company don't do social good, because we don't have to sell soap for social good, we're going to respond to how humans are responding to the world that they live in. And they're moving, and I'm not Pollyanna here. I get that they're making money off of this. I understand that. But when it comes to what's the world we want to live in, I go back to that. I think I look at a Paul Polson. I look at some of the courage he took to move Unilever in a particular way. And again, I do understand that they have made money off of this. But when we're looking at the young generations, both Generation Z and millennials, they have demonstrated that they are more willing to pay and work on connectivity with their products based on what that company stands for. So I think we have a moment right now for technology companies, for the CEO, for going back to that human heart thing, what do we want to weigh out? You cannot weigh good and bad equally. That isn't a fair proposition in my view. Today, in 2019, if I were queen for a day and I was in that tech, I would weigh good over bad in such a way that when you're working in the platforms that you're working, there is a way for us to help bring forth more connectivity with good ideas, more connectivity with a way for these young kids to off-ramp so that they're not going down the rabbit hole of the things that we're seeing right now. And clearly, we're not talking about gigantic system changes. We're talking about just a tweak in terms of how it is we think about the platform that we're using.
Are there technologists who are doing this that you point to and highlight?
In my work, I have not yet run across that kind of thing at pace. I don't know, Peter, if you...
Kind of a longer conversation.
Yeah.
So I'm going to...
Who's your guy?
I want to, I'm eyeing the clock, so I want to end on a term that you first used in our conversations, but it also captures something. Unfortunately, you are not queen for the day in these different realms, but you have been involved in an effort that is kind of part of this conversation, not just within the book, but wrapped up in it. Use the remaining 2 minutes to tell the story of your Dumbledore's army. And what does it mean to this larger discussion?
I had the privilege, after I left the State Department, of immediately going to Harvard University to be a fellow at the Institute of Politics. And I was teaching a class on countering violent extremism with undergraduates. It was predominantly undergraduates. And I was explaining how important it was that all of us understand that this is a problem, fighting hate, us versus them, at its core, that each person has a role to play. And a young woman raises her hand, and I called on her. Her name is Anisha. And she said, Farah, if you're going to explain this to our generation, you need to say you're building Dumbledore's army. And this is a connection to, for those of you who have not read Harry Potter, you really ought to, but this idea that everybody has a wand. Everybody can fight. Everybody can stand up for what's right. Everybody can say, I'm going to give a chance to my own particular environment, whether it's in a home or in a school, whether it's confronting someone on a day-to-day level, to build resilience, to make sure there is no us and them. By building that Dumbledore's army, we will be able to defeat the bad guys, because there are more of us than there are of them.
So it's a great way to end. I want to thank you all for joining. I want to thank you for a great conversation. Let you all know that the book will be available outside for purchase. And for those of you that are online, it's on Amazon and all sorts of other platforms.
Where books are sold.
Yeah, so please join me in a round of applause.
Thanks. Thank you very much. You rock. That was very good.